There is a bucket that, once you fill it the right way, can feed your whole garden for free. Not for a season, but for the rest of your life. My neighbor Walter had one, and for 30 years, he never once told me what was inside it. Walter lived 3 doors down when I was first learning to garden, and he grew the kind of tomatoes that stopped people right on the sidewalk. Big, heavy, red things that bent the vines clear down to the ground. The whole street wanted his secret. Was it a special seed? Some pricey feed from the garden center? A greenhouse hidden out back? No. It was a beat-up 5-gallon bucket, sitting in the corner of his yard behind the shed. That bucket smelled to high heaven, and he kept the lid of mystery on it, the way some men keep a fishing spot. That, he'd tell me with a wink, is the only fertilizer I have ever paid for, and I only paid for it one time. I figured he was pulling my leg. It took me 30 years, and a strange little piece of history involving a famous scientist, a bucket of weeds, and a country that actually tried to outlaw the recipe. To understand that Walter wasn't joking at all. He was telling me the plain truth. A truth that nearly every gardener in America has quietly let slip away in the span of a single lifetime. Welcome back to Evergreen Seniors, where we pour a cup of coffee, sit a while in the sunshine, and talk plain common sense about the garden. Today we're stepping away from those heavy, expensive bags of chemicals stacked up at the store. And we're going back to something older, simpler, and very nearly free. By the time we're done, you'll know exactly how to fill a bucket like Walter's, and how that one bucket can feed your garden, season after season, for the rest of your days. You'll meet 3 quiet geniuses who each spent a lifetime proving why it works. And you'll hear how, in one corner of the world, this gentle little recipe was treated like a crime. So pull up a chair. Let's get our hands a little dirty. 1. The wisdom we quietly set down for more than 400 years. Long before there was a single garden center anywhere in this country, ordinary farm families fed their crops without spending a dime. From the little allotment gardens of England to the family plots of the old country, they had 3 things and 3 things only: the soil, their own 2 hands, and a sharp eye for what grew well. They noticed that certain wild plants, left to soak in a barrel of water until they broke down, made the very next crop come up greener, stronger, and heavier in the hand. They didn't know the chemistry of it, and they didn't need to. They just knew it worked, and they handed it down, parent to child, year after year, like a family Bible. So how on earth did we forget something that worked faithfully for 4 whole centuries? Well, it wasn't because the old way failed. It was because of one clever invention. In 1909, a German chemist named Fritz Haber found a way to pull nitrogen straight out of the air and turn it into fertilizer. And a man named Carl Bosch built the great factories to do it on a massive scale. It was a genuine marvel. It has fed billions of people, and I'll not say a word against that. But after the Second World War, those same factories turned to making cheap fertilizer for the home gardener. And by the 1950s, the American backyard was simply swimming in it. And here is the honest reason the old ways slipped through our fingers. Plain convenience. For a generation that had come through the Depression and a World War, tossing a 50-pound bag in the trunk of the car was a whole lot faster than chopping weeds into a barrel. I understand that down to my bones. But every convenience carries a hidden price, and ours came due slowly. We began handing over good money, every single spring, for something our grandparents gathered for nothing. And as the years go by, as we earn a little silver in our hair, those 50-pound bags don't just bruise the wallet. They bruise the back too. Friends, we do not have to keep carrying them. The old wisdom is still here, still growing in the ditch beside the road. Let me introduce you to the 2 plants that make the whole thing work. 2. Meet the mineral miners. To brew this, we lean on a special kind of plant. The fancy term the scientists use is dynamic accumulator. But around here, I just call them the mineral miners. Here's all it means. Your lettuce and your beans have shallow little roots that only sip from the top few inches of soil. But these plants send their roots down deep, far below where your vegetables can reach, and down there they mine the minerals that have sunk out of reach over the long years. They haul that treasure up and store it in their leaves. So when you cut the leaves, you're cashing in riches that would otherwise stay buried for good. Our first miner is one you have surely cursed at, the stinging nettle. If you've ever brushed a bare ankle against it on a walk, you remember it well. Your grandfather called it a nuisance and yanked it out of the fence line. But oh, was he tossing away gold. The stinging nettle is one of the most nitrogen-rich plants you can gather anywhere in the wild. And it comes loaded besides with calcium, iron, magnesium, and a whole pharmacy of trace minerals that no synthetic powder in your shed can match. Nitrogen, remember, is the nutrient that builds lush, green growth. The nettle is fairly bursting with it. Our second minor is comfrey. And here's a bit of history I dearly love. There is a special kind, a cultivar called Bocking 14, whose roots can plunge several feet down into the subsoil. By some accounts, 8 or 10, reaching mineral layers an ordinary garden plant will never touch. And what it brings up, above all else, is potassium, the nutrient that builds flowers and fruit. Best of all, Bocking 14 is sterile. That word matters. It sets no seed, so it will never run wild and swallow your yard. It only spreads if you dig up a piece of root and move it yourself. It stays exactly where you put it, like a well-behaved guest. Now here is the beautiful part. The part 4 centuries of gardeners worked out without a laboratory in sight. The nettle is heavy in nitrogen and light in potassium. The comfrey is heavy in potassium and light in nitrogen. Each one is strong precisely where the other is weak. Put the two together in a bucket and they complete each other. Like two old friends, each bringing the half of the picnic the other forgot. And if all you have is nettle, don't you fret for a moment. I'll come back to that, and you'll be glad he did. But first, let me show you what actually happens once those leaves hit the water, because the quiet science going on inside that humble bucket is really something to behold. 3. What really happens inside the bucket, you might be wondering? Why go to the trouble of brewing it? Why not just lay the leaves on the garden and be done? Fair question, and you can do that. But if you chop up a pile of nettles and scatter them on the soil, you'll wait weeks and see almost nothing happen. The reason is simple. All that goodness is still locked up tight inside the cell walls of the leaf. It has to be set free. And the bucket is what sets it free. When you drop those chopped leaves into water and cover them up, you take away most of the air, and a slow fermentation begins. The tiny bacteria that live naturally on the surface of every leaf wake up and get to work. They chew through the tough cell walls. They break the proteins down into simpler food, and they dissolve all those mined-up minerals, the nitrogen, the potassium, the rest of it, straight into the water, into a form your plants can drink the very moment you pour it on. It is the same patient, living process that turns grapes into wine, milk into yogurt, and cabbage into sauerkraut. By the time you strain that dark liquid off, is no longer a bucket of leaves at all. It is living plant food. And that brings me to the first of 3 quiet geniuses I promised you. 3 souls scattered across 100 years and half a world apart, who each gave their lives to understanding the soil. The first was an old Englishman, and what he discovered will change the way you look at the ground beneath your feet. 4. The 3 quiet geniuses. In the autumn of 1881, just months before he died, a famous old Englishman published his very last book. It wasn't about finches, and it wasn't about far-off islands. After more than 40 years of patient watching in the garden behind his own house, Charles Darwin wrote an entire book about, of all the humble things in this world, the earthworm. And what he proved was astonishing. That lowly worm, he showed, is the great unsung engineer of the living earth. The very topsoil beneath every farm and every garden on this planet is not laid down by rock nor by rain. It is made slowly and faithfully by worms, drawing dead leaves down into the dark, digesting them, and leaving behind castings that are about the richest natural fertilizer there is. Darwin measured it over decades, one patient season at a time. Hold on to that worm. We will need him again before the end. The second genius came along a generation later, and he learned his greatest lesson by being humble enough to listen. His name was Albert Howard, an English scientist sent out to India in the early years of the last century. The government sent him there to teach modern Western farming to the local villagers. But Howard, to his lasting credit, soon saw that the lesson was running the other way. The villagers were teaching him. He watched them build their compost in careful layers. Green plants, animal manure, a little wood ash, and then, between each layer, a thin scattering of old living earth. That ordinary handful of soil was the whole secret. It was teeming with invisible life, and that life was the engine that broke everything down and turned a heap of waste into black gold. Howard wrote it all down, and that one simple idea, that a little living soil sparks the whole process, became the very foundation of natural gardening across the English-speaking world. Tuck that away. because in a few minutes I am going to hand you Howard's own trick to make your bucket work faster. And the third genius? Why, he's the very man we have to thank for that remarkable comfrey. In an English village back in the 1950s, a gardener named Lawrence Hills grew so taken with Russian comfrey that he laid out a whole field of different strains and tested them one by one, year after patient year, hunting for the finest of them all. The winner, the one with the richest potassium, the deepest roots, and that priceless sterile habit, he named for the village where he'd grown it. Bocking. The 14th in his trial, Bocking 14. The very same plant we drop in our bucket today is the fruit of that one man's patience. So you see, when you fill your bucket, you are not chasing some newfangled fad. You are standing on the shoulders of a worm watcher, a humble listener, and a patient breeder. 3 long lifetimes of work, all gathered up into one quiet pail on your back porch. But here is where the story takes a turn I can still scarcely believe. Because not everyone in this world wanted that knowledge passed along. In fact, one whole country once tried its level best to bury it. 5. The strange year a bucket of weeds broke the law. In January of 2006, France passed a sweeping new farm law. Now, the intention behind it wasn't wicked. It was meant to make sure that anything sold and sprayed on crops had been properly tested and approved, the way we'd all want our pesticides to be. Sensible enough on paper. But the law was written with such a broad brush that it swept up the gentle old garden remedies right along with the harsh chemicals, including the humble Nettle brew that French families had been making in their barrels for centuries. All of a sudden, to legally sell, or even to publicly share, the recipe for that Nettle brew, you were expected to march it through the very same costly approval a manufactured chemical must pass. A process that could run from 10,000 euros up into the hundreds of thousands. And the penalty for stepping over the line ran as high as 2 years behind bars and a fine of 75,000 euros. That very summer, agricultural inspectors actually walked into the home of a French landscaper who had dared to write the old recipe down in a book. And they carried his books and his papers right out the door for a bucket of weeds. Now, I want you to hear this next part closely, because it is the true heart of the whole tale, and it isn't the part you'd expect. It isn't that some shadowy company crept in and banned the bucket. The truth is quieter and in a way far sadder. A free recipe made from weeds growing in the ditch. Nobody on this earth can patent that. Nobody can own it. Nobody can sell it back to you again next spring. So nobody had the slightest reason to spend a fortune making it legal. The chemical jug up on the store shelf has a whole company standing behind it, glad to pay every cent of that paperwork, because that jug brings money home. The bucket of nettles has no one at all, because it makes none. The old way wasn't crushed by a giant boot. It simply turned invisible, because there was no profit in keeping it where folks could see it. And that, my friends, is exactly how good and honest knowledge slips quietly out of the world. The French gardeners, bless their stubborn hearts, would not stand for it. They passed the forbidden recipe hand to hand, and they handed it out at the farmers' markets in broad daylight, daring anyone to stop them. The newspapers christened it the Nettle War, and after 5 long years of protest, the government finally backed down. The brew was made lawful once more, and not many years after that, the wider European authorities formally recognized the stinging nettle for exactly what our grandparents always knew it to be: a good and rightful plant feed. Here in America, mind you, it was never against the law. We needed no ban at all. We simply got busy, got comfortable, and let the knowledge drift right off the back porch, all on our own. But not today. Today, we are taking it back, and I'm going to walk you through every single step. 6. How to brew your own living gold. Are you ready? Good. It is about as simple as anything in the garden. It costs next to nothing, and it asks for very little muscle. Here is all you need. First, get yourself a plain 5-gallon bucket, the food-grade kind, just a few dollars at any hardware store. One firm rule: do not use a metal one. As the brew ferments, it turns a touch acidic, and over time that will eat right through metal. Plain plastic or wood is just the ticket. Next comes your plant material. Pull on a good thick pair of gloves. Those nettles still sting, even when you mean them no harm, though the sting fades within minutes once the leaves hit the water. And gather about 2 pounds of fresh stinging nettle, picked before it flowers, when its strength runs highest. If you've got comfrey, use a pound of each, half and half. And here is the promise I made you earlier. If you haven't got comfrey growing yet, do not wait around for it. Use 2 full pounds of nettle all on its own. The researchers who actually put these brews to the test in a careful trial found that nettle alone makes a fine feed in its own right. One that stands toe-to-toe with the tomato food you'd pay good money for in a bottle. So start with what you have. Chop the leaves up roughly so they break down faster, and pack them loosely into the bucket. Now, before the water goes in, here is the first of 2 old tricks that lift this bucket clear above anything sitting on a store shelf. I call it the living spark. Reach down and add 1 good handful of finished compost, or a scoop of worm castings, or even a little dark, crumbly earth from under the leaves at the edge of the woods. This is the very thing Albert Howard learned from those village farmers 100 years ago. That handful is alive, thick with the invisible workers that drive the whole process, and stirring it in gives your bucket a running head start, so it wakes up faster and finishes sooner. It is the difference between lighting a fire with a single match and lighting it with a glowing coal. Now the water, and this is the tip most folks miss entirely. Use rainwater if you possibly can. The reason is plain. Most city tap water carries chlorine, and chlorine is put there on purpose to kill bacteria. But bacteria are the very workers we are counting on. If rainwater isn't handy, simply stand a bucket of tap water out in the open for a day or 2 beforehand, and most of that chlorine will quietly drift away on its own. Fill your bucket up, but leave a good few inches at the top, for it is surely going to foam. Cover it loosely. An old cloth, a scrap of window screen, a burlap sack will all do the job, and lay a brick on top to hold it down. Do not seal it tight with a lid, whatever you do. The gases must have a way out, or you'll come home to a mess. And every day or 2 as you pass by, give it a good stir with a long stick. 7. The 7-day story. Now I want to walk the whole week with you, day by day, so that when it unfolds on your own porch, you'll know in your heart that everything is going exactly as it should. Because I'll tell you plainly, this is the very spot where most folks lose their nerve and pour a perfectly good bucket down the drain. Don't you be one of them. On the first day, the water takes on a pale, tea-like green, and if you lean in close, you'll see tiny bubbles beginning to rise from the bottom. That is life waking up. The bucket is stirring. By the 3rd day, a thin froth gathers across the surface, the color deepens to a dark olive, and yes, the smell arrives. Give it a stir, and you'll find the leaves come apart easily in the water. Everything is right on schedule. By the 5th day, the brew has gone near to black, and the smell, I won't lie to you, is at its very boldest. It is a barnyard on a hot afternoon. This is the moment the faint of heart give up and tip it out. But I am telling you, as a friend who has stood over that bucket many a time, that smell is not failure. That smell is the sound of success. It is the very same smell that rose off your great-grandmother's barrel 100 years ago, and off a French farmer's porch this very morning. Hold steady, and then, by about the 7th day in warm summer weather, a week or 2 longer when the air stays cool, a quiet thing happens. The foam settles back down. The sharp smell mellows into something darker and earthier, almost like rich soil after a good rain. The leaves have melted into a dark sludge at the bottom, and the liquid resting above is finished at last. When you stir it and no fresh foam rises up, your living gold is ready. Strain it through an old colander or a worn-out t-shirt, into your jugs, and there you stand, holding the most honest plant food there is. 8. A little something for you now. I know that is a fair bit to hold in your head all at once. The timing, the amounts, the day-by-day of it. So I've gone and done something for you. I've put the whole thing down on a single clean page you can print out and carry right out to the porch. The recipe, the measurements, the 7-day calendar, a small handful of other no-cost feeds besides. It is yours, free, with my compliments. If you're watching on your television, just lift your phone and point its camera at the little square code there on your screen, and it will bring the guide straight to you. And if you're on your phone already, the link is sitting right at the top of the description below. Grab it, print it, pin it up in the potting shed. Then come right back, because we've still got the most important part of all to cover. How to use this brew without harming a single plant. 9. The Evergreen rules. Here at Evergreen Seniors, I owe you the whole truth, not just the pretty half of it. Plenty of folks online will tell you this Brews is a miracle cure for every trouble under the sun. It is not. It is a wonderful thing, but used carelessly, it can do real harm. So let us walk through the rules together, plain and simple. Rule number 1. You must dilute it. Straight from the bucket, this brew is far too strong, and it will scorch the leaves and roots of the very plants you are trying to help. In fact, poured on at full strength, it makes a fine weed killer. For watering the soil around your plants, mix 1 part brew to 10 parts water. Think weak tea, never strong coffee. And for misting it right onto the leaves, go weaker still. 1 part brew to 20 parts water. Rule number 2. Know who loves it. This feed is a real treat for the hungry growers. Your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your squash, your peppers, and your fruit trees. They drink down that potassium and pay you back in blossoms and fruit. Rule number 3. Know who'd rather you didn't. Please do not pour this on your beans and peas. Those plants make their own nitrogen straight out of the air, and a big extra helping only confuses them. And worse, all that soft, lush growth rings the dinner bell for aphids, and before you know it, you've set the table for every pest in the county. Go gentle, too, on the acid-loving plants like your blueberries and rhododendrons. Not because the brew would do them any harm, but simply because they are light eaters, and a rich feast is far more than they care for. And here I must gently set straight something you have very likely heard 100 times. That this calcium-rich tea will cure blossom end rot. That ugly black patch on the bottom of a tomato. Oh, how I wish it were that easy. But the garden scientists have been clear as a bell on this one. Blossom end rot is almost never about calcium being missing from your soil. It is about the calcium failing to reach the fruit. And the usual culprit is uneven watering. A plant that goes bone dry one week and gets drowned the next simply cannot carry calcium to where it is needed, no matter how much you pour on. So the real cure isn't more feed. In truth, too much nitrogen and potassium can make it worse. The real cure is steady, even watering, and a good blanket of mulch to hold that moisture in the ground. I would be doing you wrong to tell you any different. And the last rule, do not overdo it. Once your tomatoes are flowering and setting fruit, a feeding every 2 to 3 weeks is plenty. Pour on too much nitrogen late in the season and you'll grow yourself a magnificent 10-foot jungle of leaves. And hardly a tomato to show for all of it. In the garden, just as in life, balance is everything. 10. The infinite loop. Now, the title of this video promised you one bold word, infinite, and I did not choose it for show. Let me prove it to you. Because the arithmetic just may be the sweetest part of the whole story. Both of our minors, the stinging nettle and that balking 14 comfrey, are perennials. They do not pack up and die when the season ends. Cut your nettle down to a few inches above the soil, and in 3 short weeks it has grown clear back from the very same root. The comfrey does the same, and faster still. A single comfrey crown will live and give in your garden for 20, even 25 years. And some of the very plants Lawrence Hills set out in that English village all those decades ago are said to be growing yet. So follow the loop with me. You cut the leaves and brew a batch today. You feed your garden. And by the time that bucket runs dry, the plants have grown right back, standing ready for the next cutting. Round and round it goes, all spring, all summer, year upon year. The same bucket, the same rain off the same roof, the same 2 faithful plants. And now the arithmetic, plain and simple. Many a gardener spends somewhere between $60 and $150 every single year on bottles and bags of feed. Money out the door, spring after spring, with nothing to show for it but an empty jug. Your bucket? A comfrey crown runs about $20 one time. The nettle grows free along the fence line. The bucket itself is a few dollars, and the water falls from the sky. Call it $25 once and never again. Set that against even $60 a year, and over 10 or 20 years of gardening, you have kept well over $1,000 right in your own pocket. Money that can go toward your grandchildren instead of a chemical company's yearly report. For folks on a fixed income, that is no small thing at all. That is real. Closing, I think about Walter more than I ever expected to, all these years on. That beat-up bucket behind his shed was never a magic trick, and it was never a secret he hoarded to feel clever. It was something far better than magic. It was understanding. Walter understood his soil, his roots, his worms, and the quiet partnership between all three. And that understanding meant he never once had to buy what his own backyard would hand him, gladly, for free. That is the real treasure here, my friends. Not a miracle in a pail, but a deeper way of seeing the garden. The longer we tend a patch of earth, the more surely we come to learn that the finest things in this life are seldom the ones we buy off a shelf. They are the ones we cultivate with patience, with our own 2 hands. We learn to work smarter, not harder. We learn to listen to the soil instead of shouting at it with chemicals. And we come to honor, with real gratitude, the long line of gardeners who walked before us and carried this wisdom in their bones. The worm watcher, the humble listeners, the patient breeder, and those stubborn French farmers who simply refuse to let it die. You already have everything you need. The rain is gathering up in the clouds. The green things are growing wild at the edge of your yard. The worms are already at work beneath your feet, just as faithful as they were in Darwin's own day. The whole living partnership is right there, waiting only for you to step out and join it. A closing invitation, so here is what I would love for you to do. Step out onto your porch this very weekend. Take a good long look around your yard and find your first handful of nettle. Start your bucket, and if you have a grandchild near, take them along with you. Show them the bucket. Tell them the smell is the bacteria hard at work, and 7 days from now, pour the finished tea on the tomatoes together. That is exactly how this recipe survived 400 years, and that is how it lives to see another 400 more. Then come on back and tell me in the comments how it's coming along. I read every single one, and I truly do love hearing your stories. And don't forget that free printable guide waiting for you up in the description or behind the little code on your screen. If even a little of this brought some hope to your day, do tap that subscribe button so we can keep right on growing together, week after week. Until next time, keep your hands in the dirt, keep your heart full of hope, and happy gardening.